I've been a little bit jittery all week about this. I'm not sure why. Either I've been drinking too much coffee, or it's a side effect of not having as much sugar and I need to start self-medicating again. Or sometimes it's because God's got something really important to say and I can't quite settle on it. And so I really believe that it's the latter of those options. You can tell me later whether I just need to start hitting the sugar a bit harder again to take my jitters away, or whether God's spoken. Pray for me as we go through this, will you guys? And so we're going through this. We're going to begin this series on approaching God, and we're going to start to look at what the letter of the book of Leviticus tells us in particular about approaching God. And we've already read from Ephesians, haven't we, those wonderful verses that God is building a temple where he will meet with the human race, and he's building it using us. We are what Peter describes as the living stones being built into that holy temple. And that's not a theory just to be understood in our heads. It's not a subconscious reality to be assumed, and it's not a happy side effect of our faith. It's the very goal and purpose of our faith, that we together might become the meeting place between God and the human race. The reason that God saved you and I is not to parachute us out of this dying world so that we might be saved, but it's so that he can create a place where he will meet with the human race again. That's why you're saved. That's why you've trusted in Jesus to become part of this temple on planet Earth. And indeed, that's the goal and purpose of all creation. The reason God created the world. And that's what we're going to be looking at this evening as we have a bit of a run-up at the book of Leviticus. It's God's goal and aim for our lives that we experience this wonderful truth, as I hope some of you have, even as we've worshipped God together, the presence of God in the temple of God. That's the reason for creation. That's the reason for this planet. And so for the next few weeks, Tuesday nights, we're going to be thinking of this theme of approaching God, mainly in the book of Leviticus, but we're going to take a run-up at it this evening. And very often we can read the book of Leviticus and some of those Old Testament letters, the Old Testament books, and we can find them a bit frightening, a bit intimidating. We can get this image of God that he's hostile towards us, that God is saying, don't come near me, I'm holy. When actually I think as we study, and this is my prayer, this is my hope, and if we do a good job, you will see the book of Leviticus for what it is, which is an invitation into God's presence. The whole of the Old Testament system was not God saying, stay away, I'm holy. The whole of the Old Testament system was God saying, come to me, come and be in my presence. And maybe it's just, that's enough. Maybe you can go to sleep now. Maybe it's enough for you to hear that this evening. That God invites us everywhere through the Bible. God is inviting us in, because that's why he made us. We can often think that God is difficult to approach, that God is angry, and we've got to do something to pacify him in order for him to accept us in his presence. But the book of Leviticus and that wonderful first 5 books of the Old Testament say God is in love, beckoning us in to relationship with him. God is not basically hostile towards us. That's not a biblical view of God. And so tonight we're taking this run up to Leviticus, and we're thinking about approaching God. There's much to learn from the Old Testament. I'm relying heavily this evening on work done by a chap called Greg Beale, and I can recommend a book to you called The Temple and the Church's Mission, which I had a sneak preview of. It was written about 15 years ago. And the big idea of that book and the big idea of what we're saying this evening is that God wants humanity to approach. God invites us in. On a Sunday a couple of weeks ago, Paul was talking, as we were looking at the Lord's Prayer, Paul was talking about the God who does not need us but wants us. That's wonderful, isn't it? A wonderful reality of his character. He doesn't need us, but he wants us. And so we're going to take a bit of a run-up. We're going to go to a few different parts of the Bible this evening, if we get a chance. And we're going to look at this relationship with God as being the very core of what it is to be human, the very core of the purpose of planet Earth, is to be a meeting place between God and man. It's wonderful to get in your mind's eye, isn't it? An image of the planet. It's great that man went to the moon and was able to take pictures of planet Earth. And I wonder if you've seen those amazing pictures of planet Earth. Isn't it amazing to see those pictures of planet Earth and to remember and to know this is the place God has agreed to meet the human race. And he has built it for that purpose. And that's what I hope we can see this evening. And so fellowship with God is the original purpose of humanity. Fellowship with God is the original purpose of humanity. Fellowship with God is the reason you and I exist. To have fellowship with God. And I want to point first of all this evening to a rather strange but very wonderful truth, that the Garden of Eden was built as a temple. When we think about the temple, we're going to go into the book of Leviticus and we're going to think about the temple and the structure of the temple and the arrangement of the temple and all the instructions for the temple. But we make a mistake if we think that the very first meeting place between God and man was the tabernacle that was built in the wilderness and then the temple that was built by Solomon hundreds of years later. Actually, we want to see this evening some evidence that the whole purpose of creation, the whole purpose of this planet is to be a place where we can meet God. Some of you might be thinking already, nah, that's a bit of a stretch. But listen carefully. Some of you might be thinking, well, duh, I knew this. But listen carefully and think it through with me. Bear with me, I'm a bit slow. God has prepared a place for us to be with him. And he wants this entire planet to be the meeting place between God and man. So the first thing I want to notice then is that the Garden of Eden was the original temple. It was the original place of God's presence. If you were to turn with me to Genesis chapter 3 verse 8. When we get to Genesis chapter 3 verse 8, this terrible fall has occurred, hasn't it? God has created this garden for Adam and Eve to be with him in. And the human race fall, the human race rebels against God. We believe the lie. And in Genesis 3 chapter 8 we're told this, that the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. The Hebrew word there in verse 8 of walking in the cool of the garden is a Hebrew word which is talking about walking backwards and forwards. That God would go into the garden and he would walk backwards and forwards in the garden, and we're told there, the implication is that this was a regular thing in the cool of the day, on a daily basis, on a regular basis. God would come into this garden and he would walk amongst the human race, Adam and Eve, and they would be with him and he would be with them, and they would walk together in the cool of the day. It's a wonderful picture, isn't it? You know, we get exactly the same use of the word. When we get into Leviticus, we'll see exactly that same Hebrew word being used about the tabernacle. That there was this place, God says, this will be the place where I will walk amongst you. And it's exactly the same Hebrew word. And so there was an original place where God walked with his people backwards and forwards, and it was the Garden of Eden. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, when God's talking to David about the temple, and God says to David, this is going to be the place where I walk backwards and forwards. It's exactly the same word that was used in the Garden of Eden. Walk backwards and forwards with the people. I'm going to walk in fellowship with them. If you've got a good friend, you'll know that one of the best things you can do with your good friend is stand shoulder to shoulder and face the same horizon and walk towards it together. That's wonderful, isn't it? We say, let's go for a walk. And if you're young, you might think, well, that's one of the most boring things in the world. But when you can't run anymore, when you can't play football anymore, And when you can't wrestle around in the sandpit anymore, going for a walk shoulder to shoulder, facing the same horizon and walking there together and talking is a wonderful thing to do, isn't it? And isn't it wonderful that God created the Garden of Eden to be the place where together, shoulder to shoulder with the human race, we would fix our eyes on the horizon and we would go there together. Isn't that wonderful? This idea, then, of a special place where God walks with his people originated not with the tabernacle that we're going to be studying, but with the Garden of Eden. The original intent, then, of this planet is that humanity might walk with God, that we might approach God, which tells us something about creation, doesn't it? All of creation is an invitation to walk with the Creator. And then we also notice something about the Garden of Eden. We notice that Adam was the very first priest. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, it says, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to take care of it." We might think that the very first priest or we might think the very first priest was Melchizedek, or that mysterious figure from the mists of time. Or we might think that the very first priests were the ones we meet in Exodus and Leviticus, Aaron and Moses and the Levitical priests. But we need to see this, that the very first priest actually was Adam. Because Adam is the one who was told to cultivate and to keep. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, when he says, work it and take care of it, that's not the same idea that we have of a gardener today, where it's very often you're wrestling with the soil and you're fighting with it and you're cursing it because it's cursed you and it won't grow what you want it to grow and there's weeds growing. No, it's this idea of care and nurture. It's to serve and to protect. Serve and protect. Serve and protect this garden. And that's exactly the same word. Those original words, first found in the Garden of Eden, first applied to Adam and Eve, the human race, are exactly the description of priests later on in the book of Leviticus. It's exactly the same word. These are worship words. This is God saying to Adam, this is God saying to the original human race, prepare the place where we will meet. Prepare the place where we will meet. Cultivate it and protect it. Nurture it and look after it. The very first description of priestly activity is here in the Garden of Eden. You can read the job description of priests in various places, in Exodus, in Leviticus, in Chronicles, 2 Chronicles. It comes up over and over again. It's the same two words. Exactly the same two words that God gives Adam here. Work it and take care of it. Nurture it and protect it. In humanity, we've got this sense, haven't we, that the place where we meet with God is a garden. Archaeologists and ancient historians tell us that when they're digging up sites and they find temples, they're always finding gardens somewhere in the temple. They always find a garden. Because deeply in our image bearing of God, there's this idea that nurturing and protecting the planet is part of our godly duty. And as we feel closer to nature, and as we feel that sense of protection of nature, we start to feel a sense of the presence of God, don't we? Humanity has this deep sense that the place where we meet with God is in the garden. And we have that faint lingering of the image of God in all of us. It was distorted at the fall, wasn't it? But it's still with us. Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. It's the same idea. Rule over the fish of the sea and birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves along the ground. This was never supposed to stay in the Garden of Eden. God sent Adam and Eve out into the earth. He said this Garden of Eden is the model for the whole planet. The whole planet is supposed to be the place that you are preparing for me to meet with the human race. And so do you see? Do you see what this planet is? It's a temple. Everything we see when we go out there and we get the sky above our heads, and we get nature all around us, and we see the rivers and the streams and the mountains and the trees, and we see all this amazing creation, we are seeing the temple of God, the place where God meets with people. It's the place where God has set us. Again, back to Genesis chapter 2, verse 8, when it says that God put Adam in the garden, it's saying he set him in the garden. He settled him in the garden in the same way that we might put some furniture in our front room and say, this lives here. This is where this goes. This is appropriate for this place. I've decorated this room and I've got it ready, and here comes the piece of furniture that's going to go there, that's going to represent my taste, that's going to represent my character. It's perfectly set to go here. God does that not with a statue, not with a piece of art, but with the pinnacle of his creation, human beings. And he says, I'm putting you here to be my representative, my image bearer to this entire planet. And so you see, the human race is the image of God, set in the temple of God, so that God might be with us here and now. It's tragic, isn't it? What we do to our planet, how we view our planet. I think I mentioned this before, but did you know that there's a group of Christians in America, it would be America, sorry America, who think that their job as Christians is to pollute this world as quickly as possible by the most dirty cars they can find, go on as many journeys as they can, because this world is being cursed by God beyond help. And God's plan for this planet is to destroy it and create a new one. The Bible does not say that. The Bible says, God says in his word, this is the temple where you will meet me. Take care of it. Take care of it. You know, when we fast forward and we look at the first tabernacle that was built, turn to Exodus chapter 25 to me, Exodus chapter 25 verse 8, we see something wonderful occurring. If we're doubting that the Garden of Eden was the very first temple, and that was God's intention for the whole of the planet, God says in chapter 25, verse 8, he says, then, this is after he's saved them from slavery in Egypt, isn't it? And he's leading them back to the promised land. And he says, let them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. What's God doing here? Even though we've been faithless, you can read the story of our history, can't you? As we were liberated from slavery in Egypt, and we complained and we moaned, and we wanted to be back in slavery, we wanted to be back in Egypt. We were incredibly faithless, but what is God doing? He is remaining faithful. He is remaining faithful to the reason why he created the planet in the first place. He created the planet in the first place so that there might be a dwelling place between God and man. And God is this God, you see, who we see the character of God here because he tenaciously holds on to what he designed the creation to be. He tenaciously holds on to what he designed you and me to be. And he says, okay, well, if you won't have this whole planet as the meeting place between God and man, and that would have been glorious, wouldn't it? Imagine if Adam and Eve had not fallen. Imagine if they had not rebelled, and the whole planet would have been this amazing garden where we would have just walked with God in the cool of the day after day after day. Doesn't your heart long for that? Don't you think that would be an amazing reality? That this whole planet would be free of rebellion, free of death, free of slavery, free of sin, free of poverty, free of pain, free of animosity. And it was just this wonderful place that we were cultivating and caring for day after day after day, and preparing it to be that place where when we were done, God would come and walk in the cool of the evening with us, and he would come and enjoy it with us, and we would be with him, and he would be our God, and we would be his people. But we rebelled against it, and We destroyed it. We continue to destroy it. And so God says, look at the humility of God here. In Exodus chapter 5 verse 8, okay, well, if I can't have the whole planet, could you build me a tent? Could you at least build me a tent where I could be with my people? Where I could be in fellowship with my people? That's what the word tabernacle means, by the way. It just means tent. One little place, gypsying around the deserts of the Middle East, where God can meet his people. He had designed the whole planet in all its magnificence, in all its wonder, to be the place where we meet him, and we said, nah. Go on then, you can have a tent. But look at some of the wonderful details of this tent. Exodus chapter 25, verses 31 to 35. For example, I mean, there's loads of places we can go with this, and we haven't got time to do all of it. But look at the design of the lampstand. I don't know if you've ever read the design of the tabernacle, but it's a wonderful thing. If you want to get ready for diving into Leviticus, it's worth going into Exodus and reading the design of the tabernacle and thinking about, trying to imagine how majestic this stuff would have been and how beautiful it would have been, how inviting it would have been, you see. God's saying, come in, this is amazing. Come into my presence. It's wonderful to be in my presence. The lampstand in chapter 25, verses 31 to 35. What does this remind you of? In fact, you don't need to, it's not inferred, it's explicit. Read it with me. Make a lampstand of pure gold. Hammer out its base and shaft, and make its flower-like cups, buds and blossoms of one piece with them. 6 branches are to extend from the sides of the lampstand, 3 on one side and 3 on the other. 3 cups shaped like almond flowers with buds and blossoms are to be on one branch, 3 on the next branch, and the same for all 6 branches extending from the lampstand. And on the lampstand there shall be 4 cups shaped like almond flowers with buds and blossoms. 1 bud shall be under the first pair of branches extending from the lampstand, a 2nd bud under the 2nd pair, and a 3rd bud under the 3rd pair, 6 branches in all. And it goes on from there. What's being described there? What's the tabernacle to resemble? It's got to resemble a garden, hasn't it? It's got to resemble an arboretum, a place with loads of trees. What's God throwing the people back to? He's throwing them back to the Garden of Eden, isn't he? He's saying, remember what I intended for you. Come and worship me. And when we read the descriptions of the temple that can be found in various places in the Old Testament, over and over again, it looks like a garden. So many details of the tabernacle look like that. There's so much more we can say. I've written so many notes. But let's just start applying this. This changes our view of God, doesn't it? When we start to really study the Old Testament, you know what happens? It changes our view of God. It changes because our natural view of God, part of our fall is our natural view of God is hostile to you. God doesn't want you near him. Go away from him. That is not a message from heaven. That is a message from hell. That is not the message of the Bible. And it's very, very sad, isn't it, that so much of our theology comes out of the lie that the serpent told and not the promise that God gave. This changes our view of God, doesn't it? That he wants to meet with us and he wants to be with us. The whole of creation says so. The God who doesn't need us wants us, and he invites us to approach. I don't know what it is you love about nature. We all have something, don't we? Have a think about what it is you love about nature. And know this, that at the bottom of what it is that you in particular love about nature, if you investigate and investigate and investigate, God is calling you. God is calling you. And he's saying, approach me. Come to me. Do not turn away. Stop believing the lie that was given to the human race in that beautiful garden. And come to me. if you're struggling to approach God, if you're struggling to bring up the passion to pray, the passion to serve, the passion to live for him, go to that which inspires you in the world that he created, and linger on it long enough until you hear him say, "Come to me. I want to be with you." That's the purpose of all creation. And you haven't enjoyed creation properly until you get to the bottom of what it is you enjoy and you hear his voice saying, "I love you. I did this for you, so I can be with you." Changes our view of God, doesn't it, when we read the Old Testament properly? And it changes our view of ourselves as well, doesn't it? Because it tells you that the reason God made you was for one primary purpose. The reason why God put the human race on this planet was to be with him, was to worship him, was to be present with him, was to stand shoulder to shoulder and to look at the horizon together and to walk into it one with another. He set you on this planet to walk with him. Yes, we have been faithless, haven't we? Have you been faithless today? I've lacked faith today. Yes, we've sinned, haven't we? We've openly rebelled against him. Have you openly rebelled against God today? I have. And yes, we are sinned against, aren't we? And we're terribly hurt by the brokenness of this world. No, this world is not the paradise it once was. We have been faithless, but God remains faithful. And if that means a tent in the desert, then that's what he will do. And if you think that this world has beaten you down, and if you think that this world has humiliated you, see the God gypsying around the desert with his people, because all they would give him was a tent. And that was begrudging as well. And we really are running out of time now, and there's so much we can say. We'll come back to so much of this later, I hope, as we go through this wonderful book of Leviticus. But it's no accident, you know, that, for example, it was in a wasteland that Jesus met the tempter. It was in a wasteland that he met the tempter for the first time, that we are told about in his ministry. And it's no accident that it was a tree that he hung on to take our curse and to bring us life. And it's no accident that it was in the garden that he overcame the final temptation. And it's no accident that it was in the garden that he rose again. And thanks to my good friend Tristan, who pointed out to me that it's no mistake that when Mary saw him for the first time, she thought he was a gardener. The beginning of it all was a garden where we would meet with God, where we would be with him and he would be with us. And the end of it all is a garden as well, isn't it? Revelation chapter 22. A garden temple with a river flowing out of it and trees growing all around it. The tree of life. Eden restored. When Jesus comes back, it will be to perfect, not to destroy. It will be to bring peace out of the chaos that we have inflicted on this temple, on this meeting place. And that finally changes our view of this whole entire planet, doesn't it? What's our role on this planet? Is it to get out as quick as we can? Or is it to guard and to cultivate? To promote life? That where we see life under threat, to protect it? That where we see chaos, to try and bring order? Because we're still to guard and cultivate. That's the kingdom work. That's our kingdom work in this town, isn't it? That where we see the chaos and the broken lives of years and years and years of underinvestment from the government, and when we see the chaos and broken lives of a failing and broken health system, and a failing and broken social services system, and a failing and broken education system, and children going to school hungry, and domestic violence and drug taking and all those things that are tending towards chaos, our job is to not stand with our arms crossed and shaking our heads and tutting, which so often the church has been guilty of in the past. Our job is to get alongside and to guard and cultivate and to find what's good, because there's grace in every situation, you know. To be scavengers of grace and to be cultivators of even the smallest amount of life, and to start there and to build this planet up again, to build this town up again to what God intended it to be. And finally, doesn't this change our view of our church? Doesn't it change our view of our church? That this temple that God intended to spread around the world, as we were reading at the beginning from Ephesians chapter 21 and verse 22, the church in a very special way is the meeting place between God and man. That when we come to church on a Tuesday, or when we come to church on a Sunday, or whenever we meet our brothers and sisters, we're meeting with one another and we're meeting with God. And you know, the one thing that our unbelieving family and friends need, the one thing our unbelieving neighbours need who are far from God, is to come and be in God's presence when his people meet. The primary evangelistic strategy of any church should not be a youth club, although youth clubs are great. Should not be a coffee morning, although coffee mornings are great. Should not be a toddler group, although toddler groups are great. The primary evangelistic strategy of any church should be, come and worship God with us. Because this is the place where God will turn up. This is the temple of God. Come and worship God with us. Which means that our focus should always be making sure that our worship is accessible. Our gatherings are welcoming and hospitable. Not about what we want and what we like, but about what draws people in. Doesn't this change our view of the church? May God help us to delight to gather. May God help us to delight to bring life and thriving to our local community. May our God help us to delight to say no to ourselves and building our own kingdom and building his kingdom here on planet Earth. Let's live for the day he returns and makes all things new. We're going to worship him together again now. Let's stand and sing together.